the spring of 2009, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like thaw and diesel, the Holt County Grain Equipment Auction drew about 60 men to a gravel lot outside Atkinson, Nebraska. They were ranchers and farmers, mostly, working the same ground their fathers had worked, all of them looking for something useful at a price that didn't sting. What they were not looking at, or at least not seriously, was the far end of the row where a 1961 corrugated steel grain bin sat on its original ring foundation. Listing maybe 2 degrees east, its galvanized panels darkened with 60 years of Nebraska weather, a 4-inch gap in the lower seam where the skirting plate had pulled away from the concrete pad. Curtis Vance, who held a master's degree in grain systems management from the University of Nebraska and a county extension title that fit on a business card, walked a slow circle around the bin with his tablet tucked under one arm. He was 48 that spring. He had clean boots. He tapped one panel with his knuckle, and the sound it returned was a dull moan rather than a ring, which told him something, or told him what he already believed. He spotted Eldon Rask standing about 15 feet away, watching. Eldon was 68, broad-shouldered, slightly stooped, wearing a canvas work jacket over faded plaid, cracked leather boots that had not been new in a long time. He had a border collie at his heel, a blue merle named Chalk. "You're not actually interested in that thing," Curtis said. Eldon looked at the bin. "Might be." Curtis smiled the smile of a man whose job is to prevent exactly this kind of thing. "Eldon, that is a fire hazard and a grade A liability. It doesn't meet current aeration standards. Half those seams are oxidized. You'd spend more getting it up to code than it'd cost to pour a new pad." Eldon looked at the bin for another moment. He did not look at Curtis. When the auctioneer called it, Eldon bid $120. No one else raised a paddle. The 60 men in the gravel lot watched him load Chalk into the truck, hitch the trailer, and haul the bin home to his place off County Road 14. A few of them laughed. One of them called it the most expensive yard art in Holt County. That was spring 2009. 10 years later, in March of 2019, a woman named Miriam Colt sat at Eldon's kitchen table with a small sample kit and looked at a glass jar of hard red wheat she had driven 4 hours from Minneapolis to see. She picked it up and held it to the window light. She set it down without speaking for a long time. Then she named a price of $4.80 per pound. No negotiation. Eldon had 30,240 pounds of that wheat in the bin behind his house, the one that Curtis Vance had called a fire hazard and a grade A liability. There is a 10-year story between those 2 mornings. Let me tell you how it went. If you have ever stood in a county lot watching a man bid on something that everyone around you believed was worthless, you may have a sense already of what kind of story this is. If you have ever wondered whether the people with the degrees and the tablets and the clean boots always know what they are looking at, stay with this one. Eldon Rask had farmed his place off County Road 14 for 33 years by the time of that auction. His father, Orvis, had farmed it before him, starting sometime around 1953 after coming back from Korea with a bad knee and a good eye for weather. Orvis was known for 2 things: a near-total silence at social gatherings and an uncanny ability to read the smell of grain. He said moisture had a smell that came before any number on a gauge could catch it. And he was right. And Eldon had inherited both the silence and the nose. The bin that Eldon bid on at the auction had been Orvis's bin. Orvis had bought it used in 1961 from a mill operator who was tearing down an old storage facility east of O'Neill. The panels were already 30 years old when Orvis brought them home. He poured a new concrete pad, rebuilt the ring foundation with bolts he had saved from a dismantled corn crib, and installed the bin on his own over one long June weekend, with Eldon watching from the fence at age 2. For the next 27 years, Orvis stored his wheat in that bin, and for the last 15 of those years he kept a blue cloth ledger, a narrow notebook with his name written on the inside front cover in a careful hand, recording moisture readings and temperature readings for every crop he put in storage. He recorded them by month, by week in critical seasons, sometimes by day in a wet year. When he handed the operation to Eldon in 1985, he handed him the ledger too. "Keep writing in it," Orvis said. That was the whole of his philosophy on the subject, spoken aloud. Eldon had kept writing in it for 24 years when he drove to that auction. Let me tell you about the wheat, because without the wheat, the bin is just an old steel drum, and this story doesn't go anywhere. The variety Eldon grew was called Kharkov. It is not a name most people under 50 will recognize, which tells you something about the direction the grain industry has gone. Kharkov is a hard red winter wheat, introduced into the Central Plains in the early 1900s from seed brought by Mennonite immigrants out of Russia by way of Kansas. It was the dominant variety across Nebraska and Kansas for decades, which you could have confirmed by reading any state agricultural bulletin from 1910 to 1955. It is not the dominant variety now. Modern breeding programs replaced it with higher-yielding cultivars that could be fertilized up to impressive per-acre numbers, and Kharkov drifted out of commercial use. What Kharkov does that modern varieties don't, or at least don't do as reliably, has to do with moisture and roots. Kharkov germinates in autumn, sets a deep, branching root system through the winter, and by the time June arrives, those roots are running 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet into the subsoil. In a normal year, that depth is unnecessary. In a dry year, those roots are the difference between a crop and a field of brown straw. And because the plant invests so much of its energy below ground, the kernel it produces is a smaller, denser kernel than modern wheats, with a lower natural moisture content at harvest. That lower moisture content is the first half of the mechanism. The second half is the bin. Old corrugated steel bins from the early 1960s were built before the era of powered aeration systems. They moved air the old way, through ventilation slots at the base of the wall, a gap just above floor level that ran around the circumference, and a ridge vent at the peak of the cone roof. When the temperature outside dropped at night, the cooler, denser air entered through the floor slots, passed upward through the grain mass, picked up any moisture the grain was giving off, and exited through the ridge. It was convection. It required no power, no thermostat, no electric motor. It worked at about a quarter of the rate of a modern powered aeration system, which is why most people switched to powered systems when they became available. Here is the thing that Orvis Rask understood and wrote down in the Blue Ledger, and that Eldon understood because he had read the ledger many times over. Powered aeration was designed for the moisture loads that modern, high-yield wheats carry, because modern wheats are typically harvested a point or two wetter than Kharkov, and they have to be pushed dry quickly or they go out of condition in storage. The old passive ventilation system was designed for grain that came in dry and needed only gentle management to stay that way. Put Kharkov in the old bin, and the passive convection was exactly sufficient. Put modern wheat in the old bin, and it was not, which was why everyone abandoned the passive bins in the first place. Eldon was not growing modern wheat. He was growing Kharkov. And the old bin, correctly paired, worked precisely the way Orvis's ledger said it would. Curtis Vance did not know any of this. He walked around that bin in the gravel lot with his tablet, and what he saw was an aeration deficiency and a seam failure and a liability. What he did not see was a 65-year partnership between one wheat variety and one storage system, recorded in a blue ledger, waiting to be understood. By the fall of 2009, Ray Holst had put his signature on a $340,000 construction loan with a rate of 7.2% to build a new grain storage complex on his place 3 miles east of Eldon's. Ray was 55 that year, a careful man, methodical, the kind of farmer who kept his equipment painted and his books tidy. He was not reckless. He had gone to the county extension office and sat across from Curtis Vance and been told that the direction was toward higher capacity climate-controlled storage with powered aeration, and that the premium elevator was now paying a quality differential for grain held under controlled conditions, and that the investment paid back in 7 to 9 years at current prices. Ray trusted that projection. The complex went in over the summer of 2009. 4 new steel bins, each of them 48 feet in diameter, each rated for 60,000 bushels, with continuous stir augers and electric fans and a digital temperature monitoring system, mounted on the wall of a new utility room with a cement floor. The construction crew was in and out over 6 weeks. Ray watched them work from the cab of his pickup and felt, in the honest way of a careful man, that he was making the right decision. The county extension office had told him so. The premium elevator had confirmed the quality differential in writing. He had run the math 3 times. It was modern. It was clean. The new fans pulled 40 cubic feet of air per minute per bushel, a figure Curtis had cited from the University Extension Handbook, and the digital system would alert Ray's phone if any zone climbed above a preset temperature. To Ray, standing inside the finished utility room with the monitoring panel glowing on the wall, this felt like control. It felt like the right side of the argument. The county agricultural newsletter ran a brief item about the complex with a photograph. Curtis Vance was quoted saying that this was exactly the kind of investment the county's grain producers needed to be making. The photograph showed Ray shaking Curtis's hand in front of bin number 1. Eldon read the item at his kitchen table with chalk lying across his boots. The bin he had hauled home from the auction was sitting behind his machine shed, cleaned out, resealed along the lower gap, with a mixture of rendered beef tallow and fine sand that Orvis had used, and bolted to a new concrete ring Eldon had poured himself over 2 weekends in July. No photograph, no newsletter item. His Kharkov was planted on 18 acres of the home quarter, chosen for its sandy loam subsoil where the deep roots could work. His first-year seed had come from a mason jar he had been maintaining for 11 years, variety pure stock that traced back to a bag of certified Kharkov his father had bought from a seed house in 1971 and never entirely let go of. He did not call Ray. He did not go to look at the new bins. He planted his seed, tamped the skirting plate back into place with a rubber mallet, and waited for autumn. In October of 2010, Curtis Vance drove out to Eldon's place on a site visit, following up on a county program offering cost-sharing grants for storage upgrades. Eldon had applied not because he expected the money, but because he wanted to show Curtis the ledger. Curtis stood in front of the bin, which was full of that year's Kharkov, and looked at the base ventilation slots. And Chalk sat beside Eldon and watched. "Eldon," Curtis said, "I have to be honest with you. This bin is a fire hazard and a grade A liability. I cannot, in good conscience, recommend this for the cost-share program." "I'm not asking you to recommend it," Eldon said. "I'm asking you to read this." He held out the blue ledger. Curtis took it, leafed through 3 or 4 pages, handed it back. "These moisture readings are low," he said. "That's actually a concern. Grain that's too dry can lose test weight and grade out lower at the elevator." "It doesn't grade at the elevator," Eldon said. Curtis smiled the patient smile. He got in his truck. He told the county committee that Eldon Rask was running a fire hazard and a grade A liability, and was, in his opinion, a candidate for outreach. What nobody in the county was watching, in the fall of 2010, was the weather data beginning to come in from the climate modeling stations out of Colorado and Kansas. What nobody was saying yet, though some people in the soil conservation offices were starting to note it quietly, was that the groundwater tables under the high plains had been declining at a measurable rate for most of a decade, and that the drought probability forecasts for the following 3 to 5 years were not favorable. Eldon's granddaughter Lena arrived in the spring of 2017, 2 weeks after finishing a degree in agricultural business from the State University. She was 26. She was, in the plain way of young people who have just spent 4 years being educated, certain of a number of things. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the old bin and said, "Grandpa, you know what that's costing you in lost bushels." "What's it costing me?" Eldon said. 18 acres of Kharkov at 28 bushels per acre is just over 500 bushels. Modern variety on that ground with a foliar program and the right seed treatment, you could probably run 40, 45. You're leaving $8,000 to $10,000 on the table every year. At elevator prices, Eldon said. Lena looked at him. What other prices are there? She had not yet heard about Miriam Colt. Neither had Eldon. Miriam would not contact him for another year and a half. What Lena did know, because she had studied it in her program, was that specialty grain markets were beginning to develop for older wheat varieties, driven by craft bakers and artisan millers looking for distinct flavor profiles and protein structures that modern commodity wheats had bred away. She had written a paper on it. She did not yet connect that paper to the bin behind her grandfather's machine shed. She called Curtis Vance that summer to ask his opinion, because she still believed that a county extension credential was the right starting point for a question like that. Curtis told her that the specialty grain market was a niche, a hobby for boutique operators on the coast, and that it had no real scale in the Central Plains. He also told her, in the same calm voice, that her grandfather's bin was a fire hazard and a grade A liability, and that the family really ought to consider addressing it before the county required them to. That was the third time the label got spoken. Lena wrote it down. She did not know in that moment why she was writing it down. Some part of her already suspected. The summer of 2012 had already come and gone by then, and what it left behind in Holt County was something the old-timers had not seen in that severity since the 1950s. The drought came in June and locked in by the second week of July. The sky went the color of old copper. The county recorded its highest June temperature in 51 years, 106 degrees on the 14th, 109 on the 22nd. Rain that was forecast twice failed to arrive twice, and the creosote smell that comes when ground soil dries past a certain depth settled over the county like something permanent. The topsoil on the unplanted fields lifted in sheets in the afternoon wind and laid itself against the fence lines. Eldon's Kharkov was in the ground through all of it, and its roots were running 5.5 feet down into the subsoil by the moisture readings he was taking weekly. He had driven his moisture probe in at 6 locations across the 18 acres every 7 days since planting, recording the numbers in the ledger the way Orvis had done in the dry summers of the late 70s. The plant had set those roots in autumn and winter, the way it always had, and when June stripped the top 20 inches of soil to powder, the Kharkov was drinking from a depth the drought could not reach. The flag leaves stayed upright. The heads filled slowly, kernels setting small and hard and dense, the way the variety had always done under stress. He drove the fence line in his truck each morning. Chalk sat in the passenger seat and watched the fields. Across the fence on a raised ground, the damage showed earlier, his modern high-yield variety had a shorter, shallower root profile, bred for yield in average years on fertilized ground, not for survival in dry ones. By the third week of July, the flag leaves were rolling tight, the plant's last defense against moisture loss, a signal that root uptake had fallen below what the canopy needed. By August, the kernels were setting thin and light on the heads. Ray drove his own fence line and came in and called his agronomist. He was told to hang on and see what September brought. He was told the markets would likely respond to the drought with a price spike, which was true, and which would soften the yield loss, which was also true, and which did not account for what happened inside the bins. Ray's new climate-controlled complex ran continuously through the heat spike, the fans cycling, the monitoring system logging every 6 hours, the augers turning twice daily to prevent hotspots from developing in the mass. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was the steel. In the third week of July, a stress crack appeared in the intake plenum of bin number 3, where the powered aeration duct connected to the floor transition ring. The steel had expanded and contracted through 9 days of heat, above 100 degrees and nights that barely fell below 80, and a weld seam that had been adequate for normal thermal range opened a gap of about 3/8 of an inch at its weakest point. Ambient air, which was running at 14% relative humidity and 104 degrees, began entering the bottom of the grain mass through that gap in an uncontrolled stream. The digital monitoring system caught the temperature anomaly in that sector on day 4 of the incursion. Ray got the alert on his phone at 5:30 in the morning, standing in his kitchen in his work clothes. He called the elevator's grain management consultant. The consultant drove out that afternoon. They opened the floor access and put a probe into the affected zone and read the number, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The lower 8,000 bushels had developed a hot pocket that had advanced past the threshold at which the grain could be certified for food grade. The protein had degraded. The fat acidity value was elevated. There was no recovery. It went out on a distressed contract at $1.80 per bushel. Ray had been planning on $5.20, 8,000 bushels. The difference was $27,200 on one event in one bin in one bad summer. Ray sat in his kitchen with his books and recalculated his payback timeline. He did not call Curtis Vance. There was nothing Curtis could have told him that would have changed the arithmetic. The 7 to 9 year projection from 2009 became 12 to 15, and that was before the drought hit his yield per acre, which came in at 19 bushels, rather than the 42 he had been targeting. Eldon's Kharkov came in at the end of August, thin in volume but sound in quality. He ran his moisture probe through the harvest and recorded everything in the ledger. The kernel moisture was 11.5%, well inside safe storage range for the passive bin. He augured the grain in, watched the convection begin its slow, reliable cycle, and wrote down the date. Chalk lay in the shade of the bin while he worked. That fall, he drove out to Ray's place with a loaf of bread his daughter had baked from the previous year's Kharkov flour, and he left it on Ray's porch. He did not knock on the door. Ray found it later and knew where it was from because there was a note from Eldon's daughter with her name on it. He did not say he had told anyone anything. He had not told Ray anything, not in those terms. He had simply done what he always did. The drought eased in the fall of 2012 and returned in a lesser form the following 2 summers. By 2015, the county was in something closer to a normal rainfall pattern. And by 2016, the commodity wheat price had settled into a range that discouraged expansion and encouraged everyone to talk about margins at the co-op lunch counter. Ray finished refinancing his storage loan in 2016 at a lower rate and began slowly recovering what he'd lost. Lena had come back in the spring of 2017 with her degree and her paper on specialty grain markets, and her certainty that the old bin was a liability. Over the next 14 months, she watched her grandfather work. She watched him take moisture readings from the bin with a probe he had owned since 1987, wiping the probe tip with a cloth between readings and writing the numbers in the ledger before he got back to the house. She watched him grind a small test sample on a hand mill he kept on the kitchen counter and assess the flour color against a white card in the kitchen light, the way Orvis had done, before any commercial color test had been standardized for that practice. The card was a cut piece of heavy white cardstock he had been replacing with the same stock since 1990, so the reference point stayed constant. She watched him do this, and for a while she thought it was quaint. One evening in August, 6 weeks after her return, she sat with him in the kitchen after supper and watched him write in the ledger. And something about the specificity of it stopped her. He was recording not just the moisture percentage, but the date and the ambient temperature, and a note about whether the wind had been running from the north or south that week, which affected the passive convection rate through the floor slots. He had a shorthand for it. N-wind, S-wind, still. He had been writing it that way since 1985, and Orvis had written it before him since 1978. She asked if she could look at it. He set it in front of her and went to the living room. She opened it to the first page. Orvis's handwriting was small and precise, formed in the manner of a man who had learned cursive before the war and had never varied from it. The first entry was dated September 14th, 1978. Moisture at 11.3%, ambient temperature 58 degrees. Wind from the north. Flour color, cream white, good. Yield 29 bushels per acre across the home quarter, sent to the local mill on October 4th. She turned pages. The record did not miss a year. Rain years and dry years. Years when the yield came in at 31, and years when it came in at 24. The moisture readings never climbed above 13% at intake, which was the threshold above which natural convection alone became inadequate to hold the grain safely. Below 13, the passive system was sufficient. Above it, it was not. Orvis had noted this in his own hand in 1983, in a single line that had no header. It read simply, "Kharkov comes in dry. The bin holds what it should." Then Eldon's handwriting, beginning in the fall of 1985. Slightly looser, the letters a bit larger, but the same columns, the same shorthand. Moisture reading, ambient temperature, wind direction, flour color, yield, disposition. 40 years of observations on one wheat variety in one bin on one piece of ground. She had written a paper on heritage grain market development and had cited more than 40 sources. Not one of them contained anything like this. It was not a spreadsheet. It was not a study. There was no algorithm that could have produced it. Algorithms require inputs, and nobody had thought to input whether the wind in a particular storage week was running from the north or the south, because nobody had known it mattered. She called Curtis Vance that summer in a different frame of mind than she'd had the year before. She asked him specifically about specialty grain pricing for heritage hard red varieties. He told her it was a hobby market for boutique operators on the coast and that in his view, Kharkov had no commercial future in the Central Plains. He told her again about the bin. She thanked him and got off the phone and sat looking at the ledger and then looked out the window at the bin. She did not say anything to Eldon about the phone call. In October of 2018, a small item ran in a regional growers newsletter about heritage grain sourcing efforts by a Minneapolis-based specialty roasting operation. The item mentioned specific varieties by name, including Kharkov. A field representative for the roasting operation had begun contacting growers through the newsletter and through grain cooperative networks. Miriam Colt drove south from Minneapolis on a cold Thursday in March of 2019. A 4-hour drive she had made twice before scouting other suppliers, neither of whom had worked out. She was in her early 50s, unhurried in her movements, with the quiet authority of a person who has been wrong about suppliers before and learned from it to move slowly and look for everything. She had run the sourcing program at Harrow House Roasters for 9 years. She had a master's degree in food science and had spent 3 years at a commercial milling operation before going to the roasting side. She was not here on a scouting trip in the casual sense. She had seen Eldon's name in the cooperative records and had spoken to him for 4 minutes on the phone and had driven 4 hours with a sample kit and a number already in her head that she had been sitting with for 2 weeks. She pulled into Eldon's lane at 9 in the morning in a dark blue sedan, which looked very clean on the gravel. Eldon met her at the bin. Chalk trotted out from the machine shed and sat beside him. Lena watched from the kitchen window. Miriam shook Eldon's hand and looked at the bin for a moment before she said anything. She walked a slow half-circle around it, looking at the base, looking at the panels, looking at the ridge vent at the peak. She found the ventilation slots at the base and crouched to look at them. They were open and unobstructed. She stood back up and looked at the seam where Eldon had applied the tallow seal. She said, "Can I take a sample?" Eldon opened the access hatch. The smell of the stored grain came out on the cold morning air, a clean, faintly sweet, slightly dusty smell with no off-note to it. Miriam leaned in and breathed it and did not say anything. She reached in with a small grain probe from her kit and took a draw from 3 different depths, combined them into a glass jar, and sealed it. She held the jar up in the gray morning light. She rotated it. The kernels were small and dense and a warm amber red, the characteristic color of a hard red winter variety in good condition. She pressed the lid off the jar and held it under her nose and breathed once through it, a long, slow inhalation, and her eyes went slightly unfocused in the way of someone processing something carefully. "How long has this variety been in this bin?" she said. "Since '85, Eldon said. "My father had it before that, '61. This bin. This bin." She pressed the lid back on and looked at the bin again. She had been inside a lot of old corrugated steel bins in her sourcing work, and she knew immediately the difference between one that had been poorly maintained and allowed to degrade and one that had simply been aged with attention. This one was aged with attention. The galvanized panels were dark but not corroded. The seams had been tended. The floor was clean concrete, without the grain dust accumulation that built up in bins that were not swept between crops. The ventilation slots were clear. There was no smell of must or off-gas anywhere in the interior, which in a bin this age was not automatic. It was the result of a practice held consistently across many years. She capped her sample kit and walked with Eldon to the kitchen without saying anything else. Chalk fell in beside her. Lena stepped back from the window. Miriam said, $4.80 per pound. That's our opening price, and it doesn't move much. Eldon sat across from her without expression. Lena said, "Per pound." "Per pound," Miriam said. Lena opened the ledger to a blank page at the back and wrote down a number. Then she wrote down another number. The elevator had been quoting $0 and 7.5 cents per pound that week. She wrote that down too. 30,240 pounds at $4.80. She looked up. $145,152. Miriam was watching Eldon. Eldon was looking at the table. He looked up after a moment, and whatever was on his face was quiet and contained. The way something is when it has been waited on long enough that the arrival of it is not a surprise, only a relief. "I'll need a bit of time to think on that," he said. Miriam said that was fine. She would be in the area for a day or two. It took him until the next morning. He did not consult anyone else. He called Miriam's cell number and told her yes. The check arrived 2 weeks after delivery confirmation. Lena held it flat on the kitchen table, and Eldon stood behind her, and chalk lay on the floor, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Eldon picked up the ledger and wrote the date and the price and the total weight and the buyer's name in the column he had marked disposition, the way his father had done, and closed the cover. Miriam's opening order was for that first harvest. Her second order, placed the following October, was larger. She had run test roasts on the Kharkov and found what she had expected: a distinct protein structure, a clean, slightly nutty flavor register, a flour color that photographed well, a consistency of bake quality across the lot that she attributed, when she wrote her sourcing notes, to the storage environment. The passive convection system in the old bin had kept the grain at a stable moisture and temperature across the storage period with no powered input. The flour had a moisture uniformity across the lot that her commercial suppliers in the modern storage sector could not reliably match. She noted that in her notes. She did not use the phrase grade A liability anywhere in them. Ray Holst heard about the Miriam Colt visit the way people hear about things in Holt County, which is by the following week's co-op lunch. He drove out to Eldon's that afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table in roughly the same chair Miriam had sat in, and Eldon poured him coffee, and chalk lay across Ray's boots, which was a thing chalk did with people he trusted. Ray said, "$4.80 a pound," Eldon said. "That's right." Ray looked at his coffee. He was not a man who spoke quickly, and he didn't speak quickly now. After a while, he said, "I'd like to learn the variety." Eldon went to the bin and came back with a mason jar of saved Kharkov seed, enough for a quarter-acre trial plot. He set it on the table. He did not make a speech about it. He went to the stove and refilled the coffee. Ray planted the quarter-acre that fall. He was not the only one. Eldon sold seed to 4 other neighbors that season, each of them small lots, enough for a trial. He kept his price at his cost, not a penny more. He did not want to be in the seed business. He wanted to be in the wheat business on his terms, at his pace. Lena called Curtis Vance in the spring of 2020 and told him about the Harrow House contract. She was not unkind about it. She told him the numbers straightforwardly and said that she thought he might want to know, in case it was useful for the county's grain programming. Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be honest. I had no idea there was that kind of a market for Kharkov." "There's a ledger," Lena said, "that goes back to 1978, if you ever want to look at it." He said he would like to, and she believed he meant it. He came out to the place in May, and this time he walked around the bin slowly, and then stood at the hatch and looked in. He asked Eldon to explain the passive convection system. Eldon walked him through it, step by step, the ventilation slots, the convective draft, the reason it worked with Kharkov's moisture level, The reason it would not work with a modern, high-yield variety. Curtis asked several questions. He wrote things down. He did not say fire hazard. He did not say liability. He said quietly at the end that he wished he had read the ledger when Eldon offered it. Eldon said he understood. He meant it. By the end of 2021, Lena had taken over managing the Harrow House contract and expanded the planning to 24 acres. She had also taken primary custody of the ledger, adding a second column to the existing headers to record the roaster grades and flavor notes that Miriam sent back with each lot. The two handwritings in the ledger now were Orvis's faded pencil and Lena's dark ink, with Eldon's in between, and the record ran without interruption from 1978 to the present. The bin stood where it had always stood, dark and solid, on the ring foundation that Eldon had repoured in 2009 with the same bolts his father had used the first time. The lower seam had been retended with tallow twice in 30 years. The ventilation slots were clear. The roof vent turned freely in the wind. The old bin had cost $120. The wheat it stored in its first year under the Harrow House contract had sold for $145,152. That arithmetic did not require anyone's degree to compute. It had required 60 years of daily attention to a single piece of ground and a single wheat variety and a single column of numbers in a blue cloth notebook to make possible. There is a thing that institutions are very good at measuring, and a thing they are not good at measuring at all. They are very good at measuring yield per acre, aeration rate, moisture percent at intake, elevator grade, cost per bushel of powered storage, and loan-to-value ratios. These are real measurements. Curtis Vance could run them accurately in under 10 minutes. What the measurements did not see was 60 years of recorded observations that allowed one man to know, without any external input, exactly what his grain was doing at any point in a storage cycle. What they did not see was a root system running 6 feet into subsoil that has never been mapped in any county survey. What they did not see was a wheat variety's inherent moisture profile and how it paired, organically, with a ventilation system designed in the same decade the variety was at its peak, and how together they produced a storage environment that no modern system had been built to replicate, because no one in the modern system remembered why it had worked in the first place. The bin was not worth $120 because it was old. It was worth $120 to the people in that gravel lot because they could not see what it carried. What it carried was not information about itself. What it carried was information about the person who had understood it long enough to know what to grow and how to store it and where the record lived. A system that cannot measure something will consistently price it at near zero. That is not the same as the thing being worth near zero. The gap between those two prices is where patient attention lives, and it is wider than most ledgers can record. Chalk was still going in 2021, slower now, gray in the muzzle, sleeping more. He was 11. He still came out to the bin in the mornings when Eldon walked out to take a reading, and he still lay in the shade of the old corrugated panels that had been hauled home from an auction in a gravel lot outside Atkinson for $120 on a Tuesday morning when 60 men were looking the other way. What endures is not what was bought at the highest price. What endures is what was understood well enough to be worth keeping.